As you know, there's also the rules of engagement. Please remember this. This is very important. We know we tell them every time, but it's very important to know, as this keeps everything well organized and in a respectful manner. So this is the agenda of today. We have many speakers, amazing interactions, and amazing topics to handle. So now that we are a little back in the schedule, so we're gonna start by having a little game to ask you, what is climate policy? Even for myself, that I'm studying policy, I forget what is climate policy, and I want to know, what do you think is climate policy? So everybody, please go to the Menti. We'll have 1 minute maximum to know what everybody thinks about what climate policy is, and we'll share that with you right now. So please head to the Mentimeter and answer the question, what climate policy is. Here's the code, 338. Okay, we have 6 responses already: improvement, decision-making, protection, development, power, influence. It can be in any language. I'm very fluent in Spanish, Italian, Portuguese as well, a little bit of French, so your answer will not be ignored. Do not worry about this. We have influence, we have improvement, protection, regulation. I like that word. Okay, mitigation. That's a very good one. It's growing. We'll have 30 more seconds before we will have to close it. Okay. 25 seconds to go. We see that direction and influence is taking the lead. Adaptación y mitigación, good. Adaptation and mitigation, correct. Fondos económicos, okay. 10 seconds, let's go. Everybody's going a bit of everywhere. Strong effort, power, empoderamiento, empowerment, a pathway, I like that. 5 seconds, and we'll have to sadly move on. Very interesting decisions. So very amazing questions, but everybody is right and everybody is wrong at the same time, because believe it or not, everything that you have mentioned, it is climate policy. Policy, it's the end goal. It's a bit of everything. It's what makes us, it gives us the ability to create a thriving communities and ecosystems. It's not just the responsibility of few, but the collective actions of everybody. So we hope that this session will ignite this passion about climate policy, which is a very heavy topic. I understand that it's not for everybody, not even for me. And we want to provide this information and this energy that you have showcased throughout these 8 sessions in order to shape our decisions and shape the policy that in your nation, local, regional, national, international, that we need to do to create transformative change. So without further ado, we're gonna introduce our first expert speaker. We have the presence of Professor Thomas Hale. Professor Hale is a researcher and explorer who has managed transnational problems effectively and fairly. He seeks to explore how political institutions evolve or do not evolve in order to face raising problems from globalizations and interdependence, and he particularly emphasis on environmental, economics, and health issue. He holds a PhD in politics in Princeton University and a master's degree in global politics from the London Schools of Economics and an AV in public policy from the Princeton Woodrow Wilson School. Professor Thomas, hello, welcome to the Zoom. And yeah, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Raul, and great to be with you all. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to share my screen and bring in some slides to walk you through, but I'm really hoping that we can save a lot of time for question and discussion, because that's obviously the core of what we're trying to do here. So our topic is climate policy. As Raul said, that's a really big topic. It could be really everything. And so I'm going to focus in this segment on something called the UNFCCC, which, as you all will know, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is the body, the UN body, that brings together countries from all over the world to think about how we can solve climate change. And so when you hear of the COPs, that means the Conference of the Parties, that means the members of this body, the UNFCCC, as it is called. And if you've read your history books, you'll know that in 1992, before most people on this call were with us, countries promised in the UNFCCC to prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. And since that time, they've met 27 times, and this year will meet for a 28th time to try to make that promise real. And so it's really important for us to think about, when we think about climate policy, this international element of it. What can something like the UNFCCC do, and what can't it do? And how should we understand what it can do? And as we're thinking in these sessions, how can we help it do more to advance this critical agenda? So if you think about what, quote unquote, solving climate change means, it's a really big task, of course. We have to replace the energy source that we've used the past few hundred years. We have to change behavior across a massive scale. We have to make new infrastructure, new buildings, find new energy sources, find new industrial processes, end deforestation, improve agriculture, give access to a new green economy to billions and billions of people around the world, and many, many, many more things. It's a huge, huge list. So how can something like a UN meeting, which is, after all, just a meeting that takes place every year in a different country, where every country shows up and talks about things and makes agreements, how can that kind of tool, that sort of policy process, actually give us traction over all of these very, very, very important, complicated, numerous, detailed, and difficult tasks that addressing the climate crisis requires? And I'm going to try to make the case to you that actually it's very important, this body, for making an important contribution to this larger challenge, but it's also really important to understand what it's good at and what it's not good at in order to understand what makes it work. So in a few short minutes, I just want to share with you basically two ideas and leave you with a third set of ideas as a exercise for you to take forward at home if you would wish to do so. I want to talk about what, in general, international institutions like the UNFCCC can and can't do. I want to try to go, if I can, a sort of sophisticated understanding of what we should therefore expect from a COP, or this COP in Dubai, the next COPs to come. And then I want to dive deep down from the theory to the practice and think a bit about what are the current issues that are really animating the agenda in the UNFCCC. These are ones we're hearing about in the news, and it's important to understand what's at stake and what we can do to influence a positive outcome there. And then later in the slides, which I won't talk through today, but feel free to look at them if you'd like, I've outlined some of the major positions that different groups of countries have on the issues, so you can dig deeper into them if you'd like. So that's the plan for the next few minutes. So first, what can international regimes like the UNFCCC do, and what can't they do? And by international regime, we just mean a set of rules and institutions and processes around a certain area of world politics. So we have the UNFCCC as the core of a climate change regime. We have things like the World Health Organization in the health space. We have the UN Security Council in the security space. Those are the kinds of larger regime complexes of different institutions around these different issues. So you're probably already thinking what bodies like this can't do. And in popular imagination or in kind of news articles, you sometimes get the impression that an international institution, which is made up of all these different countries as its members, is somehow similar to a government or maybe to a police officer who can sort of say, okay, here's the rule, now we're going to make everyone follow the rule. And if you think about it, obviously, that's not what international institutions do. Almost never do they have that kind of function. It's not a government. It's not a police officer. It can't make countries do things, really. And so you might think, okay, well, if you have to make these big changes in the economy and society to address climate change, how can this thing, which doesn't have any power, really, drive that outcome? And I want to suggest to you that there are really kind of three logics that scholars like to think about when we think about the role that international institutions can play. And they're not the role of being the police officer. They're not the role of being a government, but they can often be quite important for developing and stimulating policy changes that then lead to the impacts we want to see happen to stop the climate crisis. So let's unpack these three different logics in order. The first logic is, and there's a bit of technical language here, but let me explain it as best I can. The first logic is to enhance credibility by altering information and incentives in a way that constrains the states members of this institution. So let me unpack that with an example. During the Cold War in the last century, there's a rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it's really a danger to both of these countries, as well as the world overall, of an arms race with nuclear weapons to try to build more than the other, and therefore making everyone worse off and everyone less safe. And so one of the ways they found to address that risk was to create an international institution, in this case, an arms control treaty. And the way that treaty worked is it said, we won't build more weapons if you don't build more weapons. So countries were agreeing, these were superpowers, of course, agreeing to constrain themselves because it was worth it for them to limit the other country's action as well. There's a reward to limiting themselves. In other words, by both limiting their own actions, they were able to achieve something that neither could achieve by themselves, which was a safer environment. And how do they make that credible? By altering information. So for example, during the Cold War, to enforce these kinds of arms control treaties, the Soviet Union would allow the United States to fly airplanes, spy planes across its territory. And similarly, the United States would allow the Soviet Union to fly spy planes across its territory. Why? It seems kind of crazy to allow your military rival to do this. It's because that kind of information allowed for credible communication and allowed the other parties to know that this constraint that they'd agreed was being enforced. So here's a way of which a simple amount of information disclosure helps through an institution, can help to create constraints that actually get you things you want that you can't get otherwise. And it's similar in the UN climate change regime, where the idea is countries make pledges, I'll talk about this more in a second, that need to be verified. And if countries are verifying each other's pledges through, for example, an international body like the UN, they can maybe achieve those benefits of cooperation. So it's a really important idea here, because it means the power of the institution doesn't come from, again, sort of policeman function. It comes from the ability to have credible constraints, and information is one really important way to do that. The second logic through which international institutions often act is by reducing something called transaction costs. So it helps states to interact efficiently with each other and to pool resources for implementation. So why does this matter? Well, if you just think about something like climate change, and it involves every single country in the world, every single person in the world, every single sector, every single society, it's really hard to find any kind of platform where they can get together and come up with some solutions. And so something really helpful is just to provide a focal point for that, and that helps reduce transaction costs. Transaction costs are the effort that needs to be expended, or the resources that need to be expended in order to make different kinds of bargains possible. So having a focal point for those discussions, it seems like pretty basic, but it's actually really critical. It's hard to imagine any kind of solution to these large collective action problems without that transaction cost problem being solved. And it goes deeper than just kind of a meeting where people can talk to each other. It's about finding the kinds of focal points that help to create a common framework for action. And here, for example, the UN climate change regime has done a huge amount to solidify the state of climate knowledge through something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific body that pools the world's information on the climate, on the changes in the climate, the impacts of that, and what we can do about them. And that kind of information pooling function provides a huge ability to reduce the transaction costs for addressing this problem. And the third logic that institutions can sometimes deploy is to shift states' underlying preferences over time. And this is a subtle one, because preferences here means basically what they want to do or don't want to do over an issue like climate change. So how can just joining something like this actually change what countries want to do? And sometimes it takes a long time for this to work, but it actually can be maybe the most powerful mechanism over time. So if you think about, for example, the United Nations human rights infrastructure, which arose over the course of the 20th century, this was a way for countries to say, we believe these sorts of rights are important and we will enshrine them in international law and also follow them in our domestic laws and practices. And that set of ideas by becoming agreed internationally, gained additional legitimacy, additional power. It actually changed how we as people think about what duties and rights states owe their citizens and what citizens should experience over time. It doesn't mean it's perfect, of course. It absolutely is not perfect. There are violations of human rights on a regular basis, but think of how different that change in thinking was before these kinds of rights were put forward and enshrined and legitimated by international institutions. It's similar with climate change in many ways, where the nature of our understanding of this problem has really come in many ways from the process of international discussion around them. And that change in how we think about the problem, how we perceive the problem, changes the preferences of interest groups, publics, all the kinds of actors who feed into what governments end up deciding. So this is a really potentially powerful way to shift over time. Okay, so that's the theory. This is actually, actually a session happening at universities. We have to talk a little bit about these mechanisms. And I think it's actually really practical and important to do so because it helps us think really clearly about what we should expect something like a conference of the parties to deliver and what we can't expect it to. So let me just then switch gears and say a little bit more about how this is looked in practice. So as I mentioned, the 1992 Framework Convention was the first building block of this regime. Countries promising and setting out a big goal of preventing dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. And this was immediately followed by the idea of having a differentiated approach where the most industrialized and wealthy countries would go first and the countries still in development would go second. So it wasn't that there was only some had to act and others didn't have to act. It was the idea that there should be a just approach that has differentiation based on how much you contribute to the problem and how much capacity you have to address the problem. So that idea is important in there. One important feature, though, of the COP process was that at this foundational moment, countries couldn't agree on rules of procedure. So there's no voting mechanism, there's no kind of parliamentary system where people know, here's how the order works. Instead, everything is done by consensus. And that's really important because with 190 something members means you have to get everyone to agree for anything to be agreed. A second building block of this regime came under the framework of the United Nations Convention in the form of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which is seen as a first step to try to deliver on this promise to stabilize greenhouse gases. And it had a sort of deal where industrialized countries called Annex 1 countries had to reduce emissions in a negotiated way. So a big global deal. It agreed to reduce emissions with monitoring enforcement of the kind I suggested before. And it's a pretty small step. Rich countries were reducing on average 5% below 1990 levels, but it was always seen as a first step. However, the Kyoto Protocol quickly ran into some trouble because the largest emitter at the time, the United States, never joined the treaty, even though it had been important for negotiating it. And so it wasn't clear it was going to have the strength and capacity to really deliver on its goal. So countries decided to try again. Let's create a successor to the Kyoto Protocol at something at the what was COP15 in Copenhagen. And this was widely regarded as a failure because they tried to get a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, but they ended up with just a series of voluntary pledges. They couldn't get agreement on the kind of global deal that Kyoto had said, principally because there wasn't sufficient agreement between the developed countries and some of the emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, for example, on how to share the responsibility for reducing emissions across them. So this issue of differentiation became a real stumbling block for getting a global agreement. But countries didn't give up. And actually in 2015 in Paris, they agreed a different approach, quite an interesting new model, where instead of having a negotiated global deal, everyone says, you must do this much, you must do that much, you must do that much. They said, you should instead decide for yourself. There's a system called nationally determined contributions, how much you're going to do, how much you're going to cut, and that those kinds of contributions would be reviewed and ratcheted up every 5 years. So instead of a kind of global deal model, the regime shifted to something you might call a pledge, review, and matching model. But interestingly, at the sort of head of that system is this new goal that the Paris Agreement sets out, to have decarbonization of the whole economy by the second half of this century in order to reach well below 2 degrees or ideally 1.5 degrees. And Paris also introduced a huge amount of new actors into the mix, including cities, businesses, investors, universities even. And we think about this as a groundswell of what are called sub and non-state actors. So opening the doors to the climate solution in the international climate space to a wider set of actors. There's some
Tom.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. We're just wondering if you could go a bit slower for the interpreters.
Yes, apologies for not going slower.
That's great, thank you.
The negotiations continued in 2018, and in 2021, there was the first opportunity to test this idea of ratcheting up NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, NDCs, over time at COP26. And I'll say in a minute what came out of that. But looking ahead at COP28 this year, we have the first review of how much progress we're making on this first round of NDCs toward the goal that's been set out as long-term goal. So that's what we have to look forward to at COP28. So that's two things I've shared with you: a quick overview of the kinds of theories that international relations scholars think give us a clearer understanding of what international institutions can and cannot do, and also a brief history of this core institution at the heart of the climate regime, the United Nations Framework Convention. So what I'm curious for you to think about now, and what it'd be great if you could spend a minute or two writing down for yourself, what can this kind of regime do? What's the value it can provide based on what we've talked about? And what can't it do? What are the limits to it? So I might just pause for a moment to give you a chance to write that down. If you want to type them into the chat function or the Q&A or whatever it is, that's great. But I think it's more just to kind of see if you can hold in your mind this idea of what the UN can and can't do. Let's take a minute for that. And there's no Menti for this one, in case you're wondering, but as just more a chance for self-reflection. So feel free to type your answers into the chat if you want to share. I'm sure people are very curious to see what you're thinking. And if you want to hold them just for yourself in your own reflection, that's also great. Okay, well, I imagine people are still going to want to think about this, but I'm going to move on to talk about our next block of questions, not just on what the UN Framework Convention can and can't do, but also to what the current set of issues are in the UN negotiations, because that's where these ideas and what works and what doesn't work really get into the impact side. So what are the main issues animating the discussion in the UNFCCC today? There are really many, but I want to focus here on four, and they're probably the four that you've heard most about so far. And they are mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions; adaptation, adapting our economies and our societies and our systems to a world of climate change; they are finance, how we create the financial flows and mobilize the resources to do these things; and also the important issue of loss and damage. So how do we deal with those impacts of climate change that cannot be adapted to? And there's many other topics and related issues: technology transfer, capacity building, others, but I just wanted to focus on these four just in the interest of time. So let's just unpack each of these, what it means and where the current state of play is on them. Starting with mitigation. So mitigation, of course, means reducing greenhouse gases so that we get ultimately to the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is a balance between sources and sinks, so no more is going into the atmosphere than is coming out. And that, of course, means net zero. And as I said before, the Paris system creates a few mechanisms for advancing this goal. First, it creates these nationally determined contributions, NDCs, so every country has to put forward a pledge for what it says it's going to do. And that you probably know about that one, but the one you may not have heard of is something called a long-term low-emission development strategy, So the NDC is typically for 5 or 10 years of what's going to be happening before the next cycle of NDCs come forward, whereas the long-term strategies are a longer-term vision to 2050 and what the country's pathway to decarbonization would look like. So those are the two kinds of pledges that countries put forward under Paris Agreement, and nearly every country has put forward an NDC, and the vast majority of countries have put forward these long-term strategies as well. So that's the pledge part. But importantly, as I said before, there is also some kind of review to see if these pledges are doing what we want them to do. And there's actually 3 different kinds of review in the Paris Agreement. There is an individual review of a country's NDC, so have they made progress on it? This is not really to punish countries that are not making enough progress. Countries are very interested in negotiating and ensuring that this climate regime wasn't going to shame them publicly, although many activists wanted it to be more shame-oriented and more able to call out those people who aren't fulfilling what they said they would do. That's not how they decided to make it. So there's that level. There's also something called the global stocktake, which is every 5 years, a process for assessing how much progress we've made collectively as a world on the goals of the Paris Agreement. And to be clear, those are the goals not just on mitigation, but also on finance and adaptation and other issues as well. And then finally, there's something called a facilitative enforced compliance mechanism. And this is a word that the UN came up with to mean essentially soft enforcement. So I said before, this is not a kind of global police officer that's making everyone do something, so it doesn't have the ability to punish. And instead, what it has is this kind of compliance mechanism that if you're having some difficulties in meeting your obligations under the Paris Agreement, says, okay, what are your problems and how can we work through those together? So it's more of a helping you get the right outcome kind of process, not a punishing you for not getting the right outcome kind of process. And the final piece of the structure, pledge, review, is ratchet. So pledge, review, and ratchet are the 3 ideas. This means that you have to submit new NDCs every 5 years, and those have to be at least as ambitious as the previous ones. I'll say more in a second where we got to. But that's not the only part of mitigation that's now at part of this UN process. That's the country-related part. But as I said before, there's a lot of interest now in encouraging and supporting other kinds of actors in world politics, cities, states and regions, provinces, businesses, investors, universities, health institutions, all sorts of different actors to also contribute to the mitigation challenge. And so there's a few different ways that happens. For example, there's these ideas of having 2030 breakthroughs, which is a kind of sector level target for, say, electric vehicle deployment or renewable energy or agriculture or forestry. There's processes through something called the Marrakesh Partnership, which is kind of UN speak for mobilizing more action by non-state actors, including some big campaigns we'll say more about in a minute. And also, of course, a real interest in bringing together the nature side of the mitigation challenge with the climate side of this issue of decarbonization. In other words, trying to build links to the role of biodiversity. So how is this ratchet going? This is, after all, the logic, right? If you have the ability of countries to define for themselves what their pledges are going to be, we really need to see progression in those over time to know that we're bending the curve down toward where the goals say we need to get to. So here's what happened in the first ratchet update in 2021. So 151 of the 196 member states of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change did submit a new or updated NDC. So that's pretty good, but a lot of them didn't. So then we need to improve that. And of those that did, not all of them were able to do an NDC with really strong new missions. So there's a lot more work to be done there. And other countries have said they're going to do it. We have yet to see where it's how much they're going to actually do. So some progress there. It still means that we have a pretty big gap between where the pledges are and where action needs to get to. So it depends what exactly you mean by pledge to see how much of a gap that is. We'd like, obviously, to be on this bottom green line here, where the kinds of actions we're seeing are bringing us down to 1.5 consistent pathway. Instead, we're in a world where the current actions we've seen are up here on this blue chart, which is a 2.5 to 2.9 degree pathway. If you instead look at not just the actions that have been taken, but the promises for 2030, you say, okay, if the countries actually deliver those promises, we'll be on a better pathway, more like 2.4. And if you begin to include not just the promises for 2030, those are the NDCs, but also some of the other pledges and targets we've seen, for example, the sectoral initiatives and other kinds of things, you actually get closer to 2, okay, getting better. And if you squint really hard and also take into account the longer term decarbonization strategies, the long-term strategies I mentioned, the net zero targets for 2050, 2060, you actually get to a much more optimistic scenario of 1.8 degrees C. So depending on which kind of policy you're talking about, there's clearly the gap is bigger or smaller. The key point I want to leave you with here, though, is that these targets are important building blocks to get to the thing that climate actually responds to, which is actual concrete action and policy. And this is really about building up a system that's going to push us more and more toward the green line over time. If you're curious, there's more information you can find about different country pathways. We have a tracker here at Oxford called the Net Zero Tracker, which provides some information, which I refer to you to check out if you'd like. This is also a way to check out some of the more pledges we've seen from non-state actors, so cities and businesses and investors and others. Those are organized through the global campaigns that we see listed here. And as I mentioned, there's a ton of sectoral initiatives in areas like energy, nature, steel, cement, aviation, shipping, cars, et cetera. And those are also part of the package. So important to look at the whole effect here, because if we add up all those policies, so the final graph I'll show you in mitigation, the potential here is really big. And I won't go into details of this because it might take a bit too much time to explain, but I can refer you to this publication so you can see a bit more. So some homework to consider: have a look at what your country or your state or your city or your region is doing on mitigation, and think about what aspects of that commitment you think are strong and which aspects you think are less strong. And there's some resources linked here that can help you explore that. The second big issue on the table in the UNFCCC at the moment is adaptation. So how do we build resilience and reduce vulnerability to the effects and impacts of climate change? And this is something that really comes down to the local level in many cases. Adaptation is something we all need to work on in a very specialized and localized and specific context. But the international global process is trying to support that through basically information exchange and the mobilization of resources for it. And so analogous to the NDCs, there's a few different committees and work programs listed here that help countries to formulate national adaptation plans called NAPs and other kinds of similar measures. And there's also a very small global fund called the Adaptation Fund to try to support financially countries' efforts on adaptation. So it's a really important area, but I think it's fair to say that the international regime has less powerful resources that it brings to bear on them, which is an interesting gap. So one effort to try to fill that gap is countries have called for a new global goal on adaptation, something like the net zero goal as a kind of core priority to emphasize and to help bring vigor and energy to the issue area of adaptation. And that's currently under negotiation now. So another piece of homework for you is to think about what is the state of adaptation planning in your country or in a country you're interested in. So important to have a look at those resources as well. I know time is ticking on, so I'm going to quickly jump through the next one, which is probably a really key one on finance. So to do mitigation, to do adaptation, to any of these things, we need, of course, to find ways to mobilize more resources, particularly for those countries that have least access to private capital markets. And that money comes from both donations from more wealthy countries bilaterally. It also comes from multilateral funds, so group international organizations like the World Bank or the regional development banks. And also it comes through the private investment flows, which are the biggest and perhaps most important source of these different pots of money. And we know there's a kind of global goal, you probably have heard about this, to mobilize $100 billion by the 2020. That was now 3 years ago. And the data comes in quite a bit later, so you'll find it is not yet there for 2020. But we're likely to only get to that goal now a few years later. And again, it's good to look at this and see what kind of contributions countries you're in or working on would like to make on this important goal. The final thing I'll say, and I'll end with this, is the issue of loss and damage, which has really rocketed up on the calendar and the agenda of the international process in recent years. So what is loss and damage? As I said, it's about giving people and places and communities who have had a damage or a loss caused by climate change that you can't adapt to, you can't just deal with it as an actual thing that's lost that will not come back. How do you help in that situation? And again, the international process has tried to do that mostly through technical exchange. But the big breakthrough at COP27 was that countries agreed for the first time to create a fund to mobilize financial resources for that. And this is going to be a big topic on the agenda at COP28, because even though the idea of a fund was agreed, it was not yet agreed how big that fund would be, who is going to pay into it, who gets money from it, and how, and what the process will be. So that's a big issue for discussion now. So that's a summary of what's going on in the UNFCCC at the moment and what we can look forward to at COP28. And you've got in your pack some more resources on the major players, but I'm really looking forward to question discussion. So let's try to pivot there.
Thank you very much. Fantastic, Professor Tom. I'm very impressed how you pack it up, such a intense content in such a brief few minutes. So now, very quickly, we're going to jump into the Menti in order to have our short Q&A for Professor Tom. We already have some pre-written questions for him in order to accelerate this. So first, pardon me, just a little step there. Okay, please, everybody, you can input your questions. So, Professor, I have a question here that has been in my mind for a little bit, especially me that I've been researching this matter. I would like to know, so do you think that a universal framework for a policy changes to address climate change should be discussed and formed in the next global stockade? It's a bit specific, but what is your opinion on this regard?
Thanks, Raul. I think we've seen very clearly in the process over the past 3 decades nearly that countries are not politically in a place where they want to sign up to one single rule that applies to everyone in the same way. And so we've emerged with a more flexible system where we have a global target, a global goal, and then a set of nationally determined contributions. And those look very different from each other. So, for example, in the EU, there's a real emphasis that's been given to carbon pricing as a tool to drive emissions reductions. In the United States, there's a real emphasis on industrial policy, on positive incentives in renewables through the Inflation Reduction Act. So those are very different approaches. They have similar effects, perhaps, on the outcome we're trying to do, but the idea that countries would agree to a single kind of approach, I think, is probably unrealistic given the very different kinds of countries we have in the world today.
And last question, because we're running out of time. Is there any formal website where we can have daily and verify information about climate policy? If for a young person or student that wants to get the feeling about climate policy without being completely overwhelmed by it, do you have any recommendation that you can share with us?
Yes, absolutely. So I put some links in those slides, and I think everyone should be able to click on them to a whole range of resources for mitigation, for adaptation, for finance, to see what I think are some really reliable and credible sources. We at Oxford have something called the Net Zero Tracker, which is working on that part of the problem. So I point you to that if you're interested in that topic, but have a look at the slides. There's some really great resources out there which help cut through the noise.
Perfect. We will make sure to share these with everybody. And now we thank you very much for your time. We thank you for your time. And I hope everybody enjoy your intervention as much as I did and others as well. And we're gonna move to our next speaker, which will be introduced by my colleague, Yoko. Yoko, please.
Yeah, thank you for the speech, Tom. For the next speech, the next session will be Emily Fent, and who will be speaking. So on the next topic, so Emily Fent is the net zero policy manager at the British Standards Institution and the policy and engagement lead for the Our 2050 World Collaboration. She plays a crucial role in managing the collaboration between the International Organization for Standardization, the UN Race to Zero campaign, and the UNFCCC Global Innovation Hub, convened by the BSI, the British Standards Institution. She has also contributed significantly as an author to the UNFCCC Climate Champions Pivot Point Report. Before joining the BSI, Emily served as a senior policy advisor on the UK Net Zero Strategy team at the UK Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. With her wealth of experience and dedication to climate policy, Emily's insights are sure to be enlightening. Let's warmly welcome Emily to our discussion. Please, Emily.
Thank you very much, Yoko. Thank you very much to Professor Tom Hale for a fantastic first session, which sets the scene for me perfectly to speak to you next. What we are going to be talking about today is the role of standards in climate action, which really builds on that policy landscape that Tom just spoke to you about. So thank you for the introduction, Yoko. I wanted to briefly give you the history of the institutions that are involved in this space that I work in. So as mentioned, I'm Emily Faint. I work at the British Standards Institution, which is actually the world's first and oldest national standards body that was founded in 1901, with the resulting International Standards Organization, or ISO, as you may know, being founded in 1947 and now has 168 national standards bodies around the world. So chances are all of you, every single one of you, sit in a country that has an ISO national standards body. So I'm keen to make sure this session really brings to life what standards can do in your daily work and life, and how you can utilize them in the context of climate policy and climate action, and how, as it says here, we can help to rewire the real economy together. So the questions that we will go through today are, first, what are standards and why do they matter to this discussion? How can we leverage standards as a tool to set the foundation for net zero regulation and policy and build that future economy that we are all looking to see? On that basis, what does the standards landscape look like now? What are we currently working with? What is already being done about this, and what do we still need to do? And then finally, how can you help in building a intersectoral collaboration globally through the role of standards together? So the first question to discuss with each of you is, what actually are standards? And this may be something that you think you know the answer to. I find that the word standards is a word that is often thrown around a lot when we talk about climate action in particular. Standards are often used as an umbrella term to describe policies, voluntary initiatives, technical standards, but I want to make sure that we're clear on what we're talking about so that we can really get the best out of this tool. Quite simply, standards are an agreed way of doing something. They are developed through committees of a group of people with a shared challenge coming together to agree on the best way forward and the best solution. So for that reason, consensus is absolutely key. And I'm sure many of you are already starting to notice the parallels between the policy development landscape that Tom just set out for you. And I'm sure you will hear this further from our next speaker when we talk about climate negotiations in more detail. Standards are generally developed to respond to a market need. So traditionally, an industry or a sector may have a problem, and then they go to a standards body and say, we need to develop a standard to solve this problem. So a great example in this space right now is the work going on around green steel. Because if we are to decarbonize industry, to decarbonize our energy grid, to decarbonize the built environment, how we can produce low carbon steel is a huge challenge that will help unlock solutions for many. And so developing standards for these urgent market needs is critical. However, one of the things to bear in mind about standards, while there are many positives and benefits, is that because, like negotiations and like climate policy, standards require consensus, there is a risk of lower common denominator outcomes where we end up going with the minimal agreement rather than the highest ambition that we need to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. But the key takeaway for now is that standards underpin the real economy that we live and work in. So putting climate aside for a moment, I want all of you to think about things that you do in your daily lives. So if you've traveled internationally and used a bank card, you may notice that your card works in all of the countries that you visit. There is a standard behind that. How do paper manufacturers know to print the same size that fits in your paper folders that you might use for your studies or for work? There's a standard behind that. And actually, if you are watching me now on a laptop computer, over 200 standards are involved to create the hardware and software that allows you to watch this session right now. The standards, though often invisible, really shape the world that we live in. But we know that we are far off track, well off track, to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, to reach a net zero global economy, and to make sure that we have a climate resilient and just and fair transition. So if our economy must transform, therefore so must our standards. What you're looking at now is a concept that was developed by our very own Professor Thomas Hale, who you've just had the fortune to hear speak before me, which sets out a theory of change for how the global governance can adapt to ratchet up ambition and move from voluntary action alone on climate to national policy and regulation. The real benefit of this, of course, is because we've recognized that voluntary action alone will not generate the progress that we want to see, we need to do more to align the global economy and make sure that actually the action that we need to take becomes mandatory where appropriate. So what role do standards play in this? Well, on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the ambitious role of non-state actors, many of whom you heard from in your last session, ambitious businesses, ambitious campaigns like the Race to Zero. These actors are generating the innovation, the ideas, and the ambition and calling for more change. And many of you are probably part of them. However, these actors do not have the ability to enforce action or to scale it in a systematic way. This is where standards can help and come in. What we need to do is to make sure that the high integrity and ambitious criteria that campaigns, that ambitious businesses and voluntary initiatives are calling for are embedded into the international standards that underpin the real economy we live in. Standards play a really unique role in the economy because they are used by business. They connect to government and regulators, as many national standards bodies are in fact part of their national government. They are recognized by the World Trade Organization as preventing technical barriers to trade to allow the flow of goods and services to continue to function as the economy transforms. But if these standards don't reflect the high ambition and the high integrity criteria that we're all calling for, neither will the national policy or the regulation that will enforce it. So the challenge we have is how to make sure that we are leveraging that high ambition in the voluntary space, bringing it into the international standard space, and scaling it across markets and sectors globally to put it into the hands of climate policymakers and regulators. A key thing to note is that this is not just about standards on their own. Standards only work if they are being followed correctly. And you've heard lots about greenwashing, you've heard lots about the challenges in the quality of net zero targets that the net zero tracker covered with you in the last session. So how can standards play a role in addressing that? Well, When a standard is created, you need a group of people, of checkers, of auditors, who go out to organizations and check that they're actually following the standard. We don't want organizations to be able to claim that they are, for example, net zero, if they're not really. So you need assurance. You need a group of people that will go and check that. But how do you know that the checkers know what they're doing? You need accredited bodies that can check the checkers. So if you're still following me, we need standards as one pillar. We need accreditation as another pillar to make sure that people know how to check that others are compliant with the standard. And we need the third-party assurance, that huge group of checkers who actually have the capacity to go out and check every single organization in the world. Now, if you want to have a guess, and I don't actually know the answer, so you won't get it wrong, try and guess how many people you think the world needs to check that every organization in the world is complying with a net zero standard. Throw some numbers in the Slack, and we'll see if you end up being right. So now that you've understood sort of what standards are, what role they can play, and how they also connect to this wider infrastructure of standards, accreditation, and assurance to check the quality of action, what does the climate standards landscape look like now? What actually are we working with? Well, I will be the first to say that this slide does not answer that question. This is an incredibly busy and proliferating landscape. The acronyms and the organizations you see on screen are just a handful of the sustainability standards organizations in the world that are working to close this gap. The good news is that, as the conveyor belt model suggests, we are going through a period of convergence, where we've seen this explosion of standards and standard bodies, but we are now starting to see more and more of these standards bodies converge and align and agree with each other. And as you can see, this is an extract from the Net Zero Tracker Stocktake report. You can see that actually a really positive thing that's happening in the standards space and in the voluntary initiative space is that what good looks like for net zero, and this will be true for other areas as well that you may work on, such as biodiversity and adaptation, is becoming clearer. And once we can agree on what something is, when we can define it, we can standardize it. And that makes progress that much faster. So that is the good news. However, as you can imagine, there is still a huge amount to do. So what is being done? What is already happening? I've described the convergence that we're living through, the merging of lots of different climate standards in the world right now. Another development that you may be interested to know is something called the ISO climate commitment, the London Declaration. I described to you earlier how standards underpin the real economy, from the chair that you're probably sitting in now to the device that is connecting us as I speak to you today. And ISO have recognized this too. It's not just climate standards we need to think about, it's standards for everything. And so with over 25,000 international standards covering everything from whiskey to the thickness of gravestones, that does exist, believe me, we need to review all of them, all of the standards that have ever been written and all of the ones that we are ever going to write, and make sure that we have embedded climate science into all of them. If our standards don't align with the Paris Agreement, they will not be fit for a future economy. So ISO has committed to doing that as part of its what it calls its London Declaration, because it was in a commitment signed in London before COP26 in Glasgow in the UK. The second pillar of this agreement is that the standards world wants to increase and facilitate the involvement of civil society and those most vulnerable to climate change into the development of international standards. Because as many institutions are recognizing, too many of the rules that have governed the world to date have been developed by those in wealthier countries, and we have not sufficiently brought in the involvement and the voices of those in middle and lower income countries and those most vulnerable to climate change. So this is something I really want each of you to bear in mind, that standards bodies are looking for greater participation from youth, but also from people of all countries and all levels of expertise to get involved. So I want you to bear that in mind, and I'll make sure that there is a link sent round to you afterwards so you can understand how that works and how that might link to your expertise.
Pardon, Emily, I will have to interrupt you on this important high note in order to move to our Q&A. I think this is an excellent opportunity to transition this fresh into everybody's mind. So now we're gonna go to our Q&A. I will have to request you to close your screen sharing so I may share the Menti for everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Can I put one thing on screen very quickly?
Yes, please,
which is that if any of you have a smartphone and you're able to scan, you will receive a link to a website that will give you all of the information on how to get involved with standards bodies in your country. If you can't scan this, I'll make sure a link is included and sent round to all of you. But thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you for your time for this. So now, very quickly, we're gonna jump onto the Menti. If you have any questions, especially those fresh regarding the financing question between developing nations and the ISO contributions. I, for example, have a very interesting question because it reminds me of an interaction that I have with some politicians in Mexico back in COP27. And I want to ask you, do you have, for example, any experience or example regarding youth collective or individual action that has shaped the ISO or the standards of environmental or climate policy?
That's a great question. So more broadly in climate policy, I think the obvious answer is, of course, the incredibly successful Fridays for Futures youth campaign. There's almost no one single policy to point out, but the real surgence of youth activism around the world, particularly in 2019 and 2020, I think has triggered a real tipping point in the ambition and pace of policy around climate in different countries. You can see it in Germany, Australia, you can see it in the UK, many other countries around the world that I'm sure I'm forgetting to mention. And it's really brought the role and voice of youth onto the policy scene, I think, forever. And at COP27, I saw the first ever youth and child pavilion, which really just shows the recognition on the international policy space that youth have such a critical voice and that they should be listened to as seriously as any other demographic of people around the world.
There's no truer words than that. Sadly, due to our timing constraints, we'll have to move into our break. We will forward you some questions if that's okay with you, and so we can share it to the audience. We thank you very much. And now we will go to a brief 5-minute break. We will come back here at 5:13 exactly to have our guest speaker. So we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. Please go get yourself a cup of water or coffee. I will get myself a cup of chocolate because it's been a long day and we still have a lot to go through. So I will see you all in 5 minutes.
Welcome back. We're excited to introduce Paloma Costa, our next speaker, a special guest, a prominent youth climate activist from Brazil. A former youth advisor to the UN Secretary General, she's now a legal advisor at Instituto Social Ambiental, advocating for social environmental rights, including climate and indigenous communities. Paloma co-founded the Ciclometers project and actively supports the youth-led organizations. Hello, Paloma. Bom dia. We're so happy to have you here. Please, Paloma.
Hi, hello everyone. Hope you are listening to me. Well, yes.
Yeah, we can hear you great, Paloma. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for introducing me, Yoko, and thank you so much for the team of the Global Youth Coalition. I think it's amazing having an initiative as this one where you can and where we can exchange knowledge about occupying our democratic place as also decision makers and holders of our own future and present. Thank you so much for having me here. I am so sorry if you hear some noise. It's happening different stuff here in my house, but I will try to be brief and share a little bit on what I came to share here with you today. As Yoko said, my name is Paloma Costa. I've been coordinating the working group on climate of a youth-led organization called Engaja Mundo, which is the biggest youth-led organization in Brazil. And it was there weekly talking with around 200 young people from Brazil that I started to occupy spaces such as COP, climate conferences, and so on. So the first thing I want to share is that we do have impact and we can find impact when we work as a community. That's why I wanted to mention that. I am also like a legal advisor at an organization that is called Instituto Socioambiental, as Yoko said. And there is where I had and started my relations, for example, with the indigenous and traditional communities back in Brazil, giving legal support and supporting on strategizing upon this international level, right? Because we are all, let's say, masters of what is happening at a local level, but when it comes to international dialogues, international policy, we have to have a strategy that is together. We have to act as we are one, as the Global Youth Coalition. And yes, I being part of the first youth advisory group to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And this helped me support and understand how the UN system works and how these different groups that I was interacting with, they could have and upscale their impacts. So this is a little bit about me. And now, like, I think like there is different solutions when it comes to accelerating to implement climate policies. And that's why I'm happy to share before I start that this week we are going to launch the Youth Climate Justice Fund, which is the first fund made by youth to finance climate justice initiatives by young people. And this all comes from that experience to understand that even though we have public policies that are available, when it comes to a structure that is so much unsustainable as the structure that we live in with governments at national, local, and international levels, that we also try to fight the other way, bringing back the money directly for those, for us, who are standing with the forests that are standing. So that's it. So starting a little bit, like when I started at COPs, I was there in this position to bring a delegation of 26 young Brazilians. And this was back in 2018 in the COP that happened in Katowice, in Poland. And there, to organize our group from Engaja Mundo, in a moment that if you see like this time passing, you understand how much improvement we had for the participation and for young people inside climate conference to do a real impact. Back in 2018, if you find like 100 youth present in a climate conference, this was a lot. And nowadays we had, like, for example, just in the COP in Glasgow, 75 Brazilians present. We have more than 200 young Latinos present in the conference, and these numbers are increasing. And because we understood the power of organizing and the power of strategizing. So what was a little bit on our strategy so you can understand? We always dedicated our delegations into 3 thematics. Communication, so we keep a contact with people back home, because it's for this that we are fighting for, right? Lobbying and advocacy. Advocacy is to lead actions, to build and to bring attention to what is happening in the negotiations. But the real work was this work that we were able to lead inside COP, but more specifically into a local and national level by bringing up and building climate policies, especially in a country and in a moment like mine, that in Brazil we were under an undemocratic presidential administration. So we had to work together with different organizations across Brazil in a big coalition, and with young people putting the vibe on bringing action, on upscaling this part of action in a sense of putting people to act. And a little bit on the strategies that we went through, it was to focus, for example, on campaigning, on mobilizing our communities through social media, through spaces like this where we can exchange knowledge, because I don't think every time people understand what is attached, what does it mean, different things that are written in bills and so on. And I know all of us, we want to see structural changes, and it is so difficult that people who are the ones responsible for the collapse, the climate collapse, to change themselves. They've been discussing climate policies for the past 30 years. They won't change for a day to the other. That's why we need to understand and start celebrating a little, much more, our local changes. Because if I might say to you, like, the power of organizing and work together, bringing knowledge, access and visibility, it was how we were able to save and hold democracy in Brazil. It was how we were able to save territories, to make sure that the Amazon rainforest was still standing. It was by working together, bringing information, making sure that bills that were crazy, they will not pass. And these articulating in international level, bringing this outside and inside. So the message that I want to say here, because I see in the chat that I don't have much more time, is that if I might leave a message right now, inside the spaces like COP, we have so many ways that young people can network and articulate to another. And I know we are experienced on our local level, on the things that are happening in our ground, where we are, and so on. So if you can understand these spaces and use a climate conference as COP to bring up networking, to bring up coalition, to bring up community, I'm sure we can build back and fight back for our territories, for a better world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Perfect timing. Then thank you for your wonderful speech, Paloma. Then we will pass to the last speaker of the day. And we have the insight of Dr. George Wamukoya, who is an esteemed team leader of African Group of Negotiators Export Support and a lead negotiator on agriculture. Dr. Wamukoya played a crucial role in the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program Support Program of the African Union's new Partnership for Africa's Development, leading African countries in accessing climate finance from the Green Climate Fund and other sources. He has been instrumental in establishing the Climate Change Unit at the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, where he served as a dedicated climate advisor for over 6 years. His expertise and dedication have made a significant impact on climate initiatives in the region. And hello, and please, a very welcome to Dr. George Wamukoya.
Yeah, thanks, Yoko, and thanks to all colleagues who have spoken before me. Very, very useful insights on the various aspects of climate policy. Yeah, as has been indicated, I lead the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support. These are experts, technical people that support the designated negotiators for the Africa, and I also lead the G77 and China, the 134 countries in the agriculture negotiations in the UNFCCC process. Now, I was asked to speak a little bit about what is coming up in COP28, and Professor Tom has already highlighted a number of them, and what is the role the youth can play. Now, flowing from what Professor Tom did indicate, is that we have a number of agenda items that are critical for the globe and for climate. And just starting to reemphasize what he said is the whole question of mitigation, and he showed you the pledges, or what we call commitments by countries, which as they stand now, we are on the trajectory of 2.4 to 2.9, which is way far above the target of 1.5. And for those of you from Africa, when we talk about 2 degree or 3 degree, we're talking about 4, 5, 6 degree because of the geographic location. And so you can imagine at present, if the temperature was to increase by 2 degree or 3 degrees or 5 degrees in the Sahel or in the Horn of Africa, which are already experiencing extreme temperature and droughts, the implications on the livelihoods of the people there and the ecosystem. So it's there. So in mitigation, the key question there is, how can we raise ambition? Because under the Paris Agreement, we have a collective responsibility to do whatever we can through our nationally determined contributions to ensure that we get to 1.5 degree or less. But as science is showing, we are already at 1.2, and there's a likelihood that we may reach 1.5 very soon. And therefore we need to start preparing what we do with 1.5 and having exceeded that target. And so the key question at the COP28 will be, how do we raise ambition? And I think the youth need to have that in mind, because that will determine how it look like in the future, and therefore compromising the quality of life that the youth have to live in those extreme temperatures. The second issue that is important is the whole question of adaptation, because if you look at the way the Paris Agreement was structured, and I was privileged to be among the 11 facilitators of the Paris Agreement. I was dealing with the preamble, Article 2 and Article 3, is that we wanted to have parity between adaptation and mitigation. And that's why if you look at Article 2, paragraph 1b, it talks about increasing the ability to adapt to adverse impacts of climate change and fostering resilience and low emission development. And that was intended to link adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. And it's on that basis that in Article 4, we have the national determined contribution, which is mitigation centric. And then you have the global goal on adaptation established in Article 7. And the intention is whatever actions you take in adaptation must be in the context of the temperature goal that is, in this case, 1.5 that we are aiming at. And those become very, very important because the current work that is being done is trying to clarify what does a global goal on adaptation mean, and looking at Article 7.2, what are these dimensions of adaptation from local, subnational, national, regional, and international look like, and how do we achieve that? And the question then arises, how do we know we are making progress in adaptation? And that raises the question of the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation efforts. And the challenge we have is that we don't have a framework of metrics on how to measure or how to track the adaptation. And under the global goal on adaptation that was established, the 2-year framework that was established in Glasgow at COP26, which is supposed to end this year, one of the things is to identify how do we track the adaptation efforts in a manner that we are able to aggregate to show that, in fact, as we're doing this mitigation, we are also correspondingly improving on the and building resilience in this case. And then the other important aspect that is important is the loss and damage, which simply refers to the residual impacts that will remain or be experienced even after the adaptation. And I think that is becoming more clear with increased intensity and magnitude of the extreme weather events, for example, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, the droughts and those, and they leave a lot of impacts and affect a lot of people differently, of course, because of the adaptive capacity. And so we need to be interested to know what do we do. And now that we have established a loss and damage fund, as Professor Tom did indicate, how do we mobilize resources to feed into that fund, and who's eligible in terms of accessing, and how do we trigger those resources? And already a transitional committee has been established. It is supposed to be finalizing its work at COP28, and the likelihood is that we'll have a decision to establish the governing framework, the governance framework for loss and damage, the same way we did for the Green Climate Fund in Cancun in Mexico in 2010. So again, the whole question of funding becomes important. And then, of course, the finance, which the intention is that by this year, by COP28, we should be hearing that we have achieved the 100 billion, and two is that we have started negotiating on the new quantifiable finance targets, which we should be able to agree in 2025. And the reason why that became important and the wording is because there was no basis of the figure 100 billion. It's a figure that President Obama and our leaders came up with, and it became a rallying point for all of us in terms of putting a figure that aims to facilitate climate action. And of course, with that, then it means that we need to look at innovative ways of getting more resources, because public funding is shrinking. And how do we crowd in the private sector? How do we incentivize the other actors to play their role? Now, with that space, what it will be important, what I want to emphasize is that the negotiations is primarily government. That's the nature of multilateralism. It's government-to-government negotiations, although over the years it has opened the non-state actors to participate, to attend the meetings, but largely the negotiations are done between governments. And so for the youth, in order to have an impact, and I'm happy our colleague from Brazil has spoken, how do you influence, is that you need to start from home. And because countries come with their country positions before they go to the COP, I usually encourage the young people to ensure that they are linked to their national focal points and they engage in the country positioning of the agenda and what they would like to get out of the meetings. And that means then you have two options. One, you can be included as a youth as part of the national delegation, which means therefore you'll be able to attend even the closed meetings so that you are able to understand what is happening, but also contribute in the sense that because you're part of the national delegation and you can speak to your head of delegation and say, this could be important for our youth. Can we take the floor and say something about it? The other way, of course, is that there's a lot of emphasis on encouraging non-state actors as observers, and the youth are now being given a lot of space. And from Sharm el-Sheikh, we had a big delegation of youth, and it has been increasing. And we have also been promised by the incoming co-presidency that the youth and children are going to be a focus for COP28. There's efforts to support many of the delegations to attend. But what is important is the messaging. What message do you have that you would like the negotiators, those government delegates who have been designated to negotiate on behalf of the government, to take into account when they are negotiating on the various agenda items? So it's always important that you look at what is the agenda, and then you see how do we get the youth issues captured into that, and then you craft a messaging around that, which then you can share through various platforms with the different delegations. And usually you'll find that they do listen, but also you are encouraged to form those coalitions that our colleague from Brazil has talked about during the COP, because then youth are normally given an opportunity during the opening plenary, but also the contact groups to make statements, and through those statements you can highlight the key areas that are important for the youth, which will be important for consideration during that session. And then finally, it's also important that the youth, you get to know and understand the process, because if you don't understand, if you don't take time to understand, or you are not exposed to how the multilateral UNFCCC process works, then you realize that you may not be able to align your advocacy with the messaging that is required for that intended purpose. Because negotiators like very precise message that they will check whether it will be in the interest of their country or not, or in their group, because as we negotiate as a group, as Africa, or we negotiate as G77, or LDCs, or ILAC, or EOSIS, in the case of island states, and many others. And therefore, it's important that you get, one, to understand what the agenda is, and number two is you need to understand the process. And usually decisions are made at the country level before the delegates leave for the COP. They usually have their meetings where they prepare the country position. And so youth, you need to engage at the national level so that some of your issues are already covered at the national level. And then you are able to magnify them when you come to the COP. But if you wait at the COP, it is sometimes very difficult, because once the capitals have signed off the message and the key messages, in the case of Africa, once the ministers have signed off and the heads of state have signed off, it becomes very difficult, even if you talk to us at the COP, to change that position, because it requires us to seek guidance from the ministers and from the head of states in that respect. But what I want to emphasize is that there is increasing space for the youth, and we would encourage the youth to really play a critical role by engaging at the national level, being part of the national delegations. And I'm happy to indicate that our organization runs a leadership program, and we have now trained over 700 African experts, of which 75% are youth, and many of them, I was happy to see many of them in Bonn as part of national delegations, and that already sends a signal that the training is positioning the youth to be able to occupy that space that is critical for that. We plan, since we're having the Africa Climate Summit in early first week of September, we're planning to have a training for about 40 youths that have been selected, who will then attend the youth assembly that will precede the African Climate Summit. So just to re-emphasize that youths have been identified as a critical team and player in the multilateralism. They are being given a lot of space to engage, but you need to claim that space by, one, understanding the issues under discussions and crafting messages that speak to influence those work streams of negotiations. But number two, you ought to be inside the room where negotiations are happening by being part of the national delegations. And I can assure you, with the current interest in the youth affairs, your governments will be able to include you in their national delegations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wamukoya. Very insightful intakes for you. We will have a Q&A session for you. We will open right now, or Menti. So please, everybody that has a question for Dr. Wamukoya, please share it on the Menti. Perfect. Please share it on the Menti. Two starters. There's something that that's stuck in my mind, which was, you said that you has a lot of potential to enact change. However, we have seen that it has been growing into the climate debate, especially in COP27, as you mentioned. But we want to know, how can we take it to the next level? So how can, for example, enact local change? So you mentioned that defining what is adaptation and global adaptation is very complicated, but within our local reality, let's say, how can we, the youth, can put forward a certain definition or a certain agenda into the local and then transform that local agenda into a national one? Do you have any recommendations or any suggestions on how can we, the youth, move this needle towards a positive, transformative transformation and change?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think if you look at many of our national determined contributions, which have been submitted by countries, and especially from developing countries, you'll find that a lot of focus is on adaptation. And two is that there are opportunities for innovative ways of dealing with the challenge posed by climate change, whether it's drought or flooding or different extreme weather events. And therefore, what I would challenge the youth would be is to come up with ideas on how to solve a problem being felt by a local community. And out of that, then you'll be able to test the idea and see, building on the indigenous and traditional knowledge, and be able to see what is working, what's not working, and see the extent to which the public policy is an enabler for that innovation. And invariably, you'll find that the existing policy may not be appropriate, and that can actually trigger a change in the policy by just that new innovation which needs to be brought to scale. And therefore, for me, is let us not wait for somebody to do anything. Let us be innovative in whatever way we are doing, work with the communities, identify local solutions, see how we can further refine those local solutions with the best available science and indigenous knowledge. And with that, then we may create a new way of doing things, which then can be brought to scale and shift the public policy both at the local level, national level, and even at international level. There are occasions where we have requested case studies from countries, and we put out a call for submissions to UNFCCC, and we don't get any. And that already disadvantages us, because then we're not able to share what our people are doing, which could be brought to international scale and mobilize support to help our community. So yes, there are opportunities. Let us not wait to be told what to do. Let us attack this challenge and find innovative ways of dealing with it, building on the local knowledge, but also the best available science. Over.
That's really, really good, Dr. Wamukoya. And another question would be, from your opinion, especially coming from the Global South. I also come from the Global South, from South America, which is we have some struggles regarding adaptation, financial, technological, in terms of manpower, to either implement it, design it, or track it. What would be the best mechanism to do so, especially for those that are enveloped or confined within the climate problems that they will face? So how can we track the adaptation? How can we avoid maladaptation?
Yeah, very, very important. There are two things there. One is that we need to look at the actions that are being designed and the extent to which they are going to provide or to deliver the desired objectives. And we need to be able to track as to whether the policy or the actions that you have designed and being implementing are meeting the assumptions that you have made and therefore delivering the objective. And quite often you'll find that when you make certain assumptions, you assume it will be a stable system, and therefore things will move in the right in the manner that you have proposed. But in reality, you'll find that different policy actions may be received differently by different people, communities, and therefore you need to keep on checking your assumptions so that you avoid unintended consequences, which may in fact lead to maladaptation. And the other one, which results in maladaptation, is the designing of a project where you are looking at only your locality or the country, and forgetting that you can do an adaptation action in one country and it becomes a maladaptation or contributes to maladaptation in a contiguous country or a neighboring country, especially countries where there is transhumance, people moving from one country to another based on, for example, in the Horn of Africa, because of the pastoral nature of our people. At a particular time, they are in one country, then they move to another country in search of pasture or water. That's the first thing. And so you need to have a robust M&E framework. And I think there are more proxy indicators, although we don't have an agreed M&E framework for adaptation, but at least there are proxy indicators that you can actually use in order to track progress. But the other aspect from the global south, which we have discussed also at international level, is the level of technical capacity to develop what we call bankable proposals. And in Africa, we're trying to address that by establishing teams and working with teams in countries so that we are able to work with them, because the challenge many of our colleagues have is putting across what we call climate rationale, because for you to get climate finance, you need to demonstrate the climate anchor that you are trying to deal with. And that becomes a challenge because invariably we don't have baseline information, and as a consequence, it becomes difficult to frame the climate rationale. And therefore we need to build capacities of our nationals so that we avoid a situation where we just fly in, fly out consultants who do the work and then they go, and then we have our people who are not able to implement because they were not involved and they don't understand the underlying reasons or basis upon which certain actions have been put out. And so that capacity building in terms of project development and climate rationale, so that you are able to leverage the climate finance, is very, very important. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wamukoya. We have here a question that is addressed for Paloma Costa. So they're asking here, from your experience, Paloma, what will be the best way to create a ripple effect impact at COP and later on and at the local level as well?
How can you repeat? Sorry.
Yes, of course. So they're asking you, from your experience within the field, the climate space and the climate debate, what is the best way for us, I assume it's us, the youth, but I'll assume it's everybody as well, to create a ripple effect that can impact COP and also or local governments or national governments and so on?
Thank you. Well, I think across the years, we developed like different strategies to do that, right? And we got off from streets to courts, I am one of the authors from a legal action here in Brazil, together with my friends, that we asked to Brazil to withdraw the last NDC that we presented. And now we are starting a national procedure to review our NDC. But also, like, street impact makes impact. During the last administration, we went through the street with different artists, with people here from Brazil that were well known, and we asked for some bills to not go forward. We talked directly with policymakers in national and international levels. So I think like the power comes in articulating and in community, because when you go representing a group like the youth, but also with a coalition, with organizations, with the diversity from our world, from our countries, then the impact is much bigger than just coming for that and just doing so. Campaign for that in community and with affection. Hope it answered.
Thank you. Yeah. It's been very informative. I think a lot of people will be very pleased with this. So now we have to go to the sad part of the session, which is the ending. I know a lot of us have a lot of questions and a lot of things that we want to ask, but I would like to first mention about our next session, which will be on August 23, and we will be tackling the very important topic, but not very spoken topic, about indigenous rights and climate change. We will have the speakers mentioned throughout this week in our social media, so please do not miss it. It will be highly interesting. Second, I want to share this little, I would say it's an interactive game that we're gonna post on the message. This is the En-ROADS, the climate interactive developed by the MIT management. This is a heavily interactive way to understand how climate policy works in terms of many different sectors, such as energy, transport, agriculture, carbon removal, growth, etc. And it tells you how complicated it is to create a global climate policy that allows us to reach net low or negative greenhouse emissions. So I highly recommend you all to interact with it, play, take a screenshot, share it with us by tagging us in order to see what is the perfect climate policy scenario for you in order to have a sustainable future. Second, a reminder about our Terra partnership. Or Terra, as you may know, is our partner that provides us with additional educative content for you all for free, thanks to their partnership and their help. You may have already received an email regarding Terra, so please do sign up. Use your email, the same one that you used to register this training, in order to access to it. And I heavily emphasize you to do it and encourage you to do it, as this will be up only until the end of our training, which will be around October. So please, if you want to delve deeper into the matter and learn more, please do so by signing up to Terra. And then again, please also join our Slack so you can interact with other members and put your ideas there in the Slack, so they can be forever in the Slack and we can always keep up with them. So please join our Slack. And last but not least, a huge thanks and a profound to our founders and contributors, the Oxford University Net Zero, the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, the Van Houten Fund, as well as our partners with Eco Interpreters that have provided us with the amazing translation work that you are hearing right now. So thank you very much to all. They have made this project from a dream to a reality. So as always, in the end, we have the attendance form. You have until the 23 of August to fill this form in order to fill your attendance. So here is the QR code, as well as the link that will be posted in the chat do not forget to do so, as this is relevant for your for us to tracking your attendance as well as you receiving the I forgot the word. It's not a diploma, but you know what I mean. I have completely forgot the word. So thank you so much for your timing. To our speakers, a very warm thank you for the time and consideration, as well as all the participants that have taken the time to join us today. Thank you so much. Please do get involved, as Emily's pointing out, get involved in the climate standards, connect in LinkedIn, connect with each other, and let's work together towards a sustainable, equitable, and fair future for all. Thank you so much, everybody, and a warm good night, good evening, and good morning to you all.